Now here with the latest evening headlines, it's the ITV News at 10.
It was meant to finally be business as usual in England today, but for the government, it hasn't quite gone to plan.
3, 2, 1.
Clubs reopened, but ministers immediately announced plans for vaccine passports for anyone who goes to them. And disappointment in the West End after one of its biggest shows is cancelled due to pings. One of the theatre's leading voices says the whole thing's a shambles.
Please, please, will this government, for once, listen to us, listen. We do know what we're doing. We do. Just listen and not all these platitudes and endless blunt instruments.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister backtracks and won't guarantee that restrictions won't make a comeback. So, with rising cases, has the government been too hasty? Also on News at 10 tonight. We're in Germany and Belgium as the big clean-up begins after the devastating floods, as families witness the enormity of the damage. Here, it's just going to get hotter, apparently, so we're being warned about just how extreme the weather could get. And
thrown wide open the doors of the Royal Albert Hall.
From boxing to tennis, sumo wrestling and Jimi Hendrix, celebrating the varied life of the Royal Albert Hall on its 150th birthday.
This is ITV News at 10 with Charlene White.
Good evening. In the end, today, the much-anticipated July the 19th in England, when restrictions ended, of course, didn't quite live up to its billing. Millions of people carried on working from home or were self-isolating, including the Prime Minister himself, in the splendid isolation of his official country residence. Mr Johnson sounded cautious at his news conference this afternoon and even talked of bringing in a new restriction on nightclubs, which had only reopened at midnight, along with other crowded venues. From the end of September, no one will be allowed in without proof of 2 vaccinations. But whereas clubbers got their big night out, tonight's opening of the new Andrew Lloyd Webber musical Cinderella has been cancelled. One cast member tested positive, so others had to self-isolate. Lord Lloyd Webber told us it was unfair.
3, 2, 1.
For some, they simply couldn't wait a single second longer for the start of so-called Freedom Day. At the stroke of midnight, nightclubs across England saw celebrations 16 months in the waiting. No masks, certainly no social distancing in sight. But from the end of September, all of this will only be available to the double jabbed. In fact, entry to any venue with large crowds will require proof of 2 vaccines. The news announced by Boris Johnson this afternoon from self-isolation. At his Chequers country retreat, pinged by NHS Test and Trace, he was unable to leave the house on Freedom Day, but he said he'll change the rules to allow other key workers to avoid the same fate.
We will protect crucial services, including the staffing of our hospitals and our care homes, the supplies of food, water, electricity and medicines, the running of our trains, the protection of our borders, the defence of our realm, by making sure that a very small number of named, fully vaccinated critical workers are able to leave their isolation solely for the work that I have described.
You always said the roadmap was cautious but irreversible. But with so much uncertainty over how high infection rates and hospitalisations could get, do you concede that is now a promise you can no longer keep?
We can't guarantee that. Something could obviously happen that changes our calculations. We've got to be humble in the face of nature.
Freedom, though, was not meant to look like this. This West End theatre should be full tonight for the opening of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cinderella. Instead, the show has been cancelled indefinitely after one actor tested positive and the rest of the cast were forced to self-isolate, despite them all testing negative.
We cannot function with this, current system. We can't isolate every time somebody may or may not have it. It just simply doesn't work. Please, will this government for once listen to us, listen. We do know what we're doing. We do.
You say the government don't get it. Do you worry deep down that the government don't care, and that's the problem here?
I do worry at the end of the day that the government doesn't regard theatre as anything other than nice to have. I don't think they have a clue of what the real economic value to the country theatre is.
And it's not just theatres. Hospitality is also struggling to stay open under the weight of isolation. Mowgli Street Food has had to close 3 of its 12 restaurants, with 85 of its workers currently in quarantine, despite only 4 testing positive for COVID.
A test and release system, for instance, would work perfectly well. You can test and release from when you come back from abroad, but why on earth when you're going into your workplace can't we do that? That would really help immensely.
But with cases rising rapidly, it's one rule the government isn't willing to change. And while the rules on masks may have changed to guidance today, there was little evidence people had changed their behaviour. On Liverpool's trains, masks were out in full force. On London's tube network, there was an 85% compliance on face coverings, as across England,
Jonathan and Jess
Day
will be back at
felt
6 o'clock
with
all the latest
Daniel
news
Hewitt,
from
News at
around
10.
the islands. Until then, you can keep up to date on
As
our
England's
website,
final
itv.com
restrictions are lifted, the scientist whose advice prompted the original lockdown in March last year has told us that today's opening up is a calculated risk. Neil Ferguson, or Professor Lockdown as he became known, says there could eventually be as many as 200,000 cases a day.
Without vaccines, there'd be no Freedom Day at all. But they're not the only factor dictating how dangerous or not the growing wave of COVID is going to be. A rapid return to normal behaviour now could push cases far beyond levels we've seen before. But the closing of schools for summer this week might do a lot to dampen the coming surge. Each is highly unpredictable, and while the government insists it's not a gamble, their leading science advisor knows it is.
This is a calculated risk. In reality, what we're going to have to do is wait probably for about 3 or 4 weeks for the impact of today to be felt on case numbers, truly. And then we'll be in a better position to say really, what size is this third wave going to be.
Case numbers are already close to the peak we saw in January, with numbers doubling every 2 weeks or so. Computer models predict we'll hit 100,000 cases by early August. What's much less certain is whether that's the peak or cases continue to rise to an unimaginable 200,000 later in the month.
Worst case could go up to 200, maybe even 250,000 cases a day. That's perhaps less critical, though, than what the hospital demand is. We are going to hit 1,000 admissions a day, regardless of what happens. Now, the real question is, do we hit 2,000, which would be half the peak reached in the second wave, or in the worst case, 4,000, which would be very comparable with what we were seeing in the second wave?
Because of vaccines, even those worst case numbers translate into mortality figures just a fraction of the January peak. But NHS doctors are still very concerned about capacity in the system.
Any added stress from viral infections causing hospitalisations and intensive care admissions, plus the emergencies, plus the efforts to catch up on the elective waiting lists, which are more than 5 million people, means we've got a really serious triple threat this coming winter.
Officials this evening making the same appeal for common sense and restraint.
If we are gradual and cautious, and we don't tear the pants out of this just because we're glad to have our full freedoms back, then we will materially affect the size and shape of the remainder of this epidemic curve.
If everyone does their bit and hospital admissions and deaths remain low, there's a good chance the government will win this public health gamble. But the odds are very uncertain and the risks very real. Tom Clark, News at 10.
There hasn't been the rush back into work today that some had predicted. Plenty of workers who could carry on working from home did. But some businesses have abandoned the old restrictions, whereas others have left them as they were.
This is the first time in more than a year that Denzel's seen the nightclub he calls his office. What's it like?
Feels weird being back.
He was furloughed through the pandemic and is getting ready for his first shift.
How much are you looking forward to getting back?
Quite a lot, because I know I'm in charge of how much I earn now, so I can make sure I'm earning the right amount that I need, instead of being on furlough where it's just like they decide how much you need.
And for some office workers like Sarah, getting back to her desk after months at home is a welcome relief.
It was just nice walking into the office, seeing people for the first time and being able to just, have a chat over a cup of coffee, which you don't realise you've missed, but you've definitely missed.
But even as they rip away the restrictions that have limited the number of people who can come in, bosses here say flexible working is likely to stick.
I don't think we'll ever go back. I think there has been a real, change over the last 18 months.
How close to normal do you think we are?
I think it will take some time, and I think the summer holidays mean it will take some time, and some of the other things going on in terms of infection rates means that we're still some way away from normal.
Today was originally supposed to be the day workers came flooding back to business districts like this, which have stood largely empty throughout the pandemic. But many simply feel it's safer or just more convenient to work from home, especially as cases rise. It's bad news for city centre cafes on streets like this, where 2 have already closed. Today there was no sign of customers coming back.
100% been the quietest day so far. It's just trickled in. I need them offices back now. They're our bread and butter. That's where we make the big money. That's where we're paying the staff and everyone coming in. We need them people to come in.
And for businesses across the country, COVID has already come at an enormous cost. While the restrictions are gone, the changes the pandemic leaves behind are everywhere to see. Hannah Miller, News at 10, Manchester.
Well, today's not been the joyous new beginning for everyone. For the 3.7 million clinically very vulnerable people in England and those worried about the virus, today means more limits on their daily lives. They'll feel even less comfortable going out when fewer people are wearing masks or socially distancing. In the run-up to today, one charity said they'd had a tidal wave of people getting in touch, asking for support.
There's little for Hannah Deacon to celebrate today. Still stuck at home in Surrey, she's dubbed it Exclusion Day. A rare illness means she's extremely vulnerable and thinks disabled people like her are being forgotten.
We have, valuable lives and input to society, whereas it's been looked at that actually almost like, oh, don't worry about them, and actually then is it going to turn into more of like the survival of the fittest?
The 30-year-old's only been to the supermarket once this year. She and her mum fear even those trips will now stop.
At the moment, I can't really see an end, but I very much hope that things will improve or there'll be ways that they can make it safer for everyone to go out and live.
Outwardly, society may appear to be returning to normal, but this conceals underlying anxieties. According to the mental health charity Mind, months of isolation have left people emotionally fragile.
For some people, walking out the door, going and catching a bus, going to your place of work, all brings with it additional levels of anxiety. And those are the kinds of things that we know people will have to take time to walk back into. And for many people, that's not easy.
And now let's just take a moment to connect with the baby. So just...
At a yoga class for expectant mums in Hertfordshire, they're particularly concerned, especially since many are not vaccinated. Now 35 weeks pregnant, Charlotte felt there was a lot of conflicting advice.
You've decided not to get vaccinated. In hindsight, do you think that was a mistake?
So it's just very confusing, and when you talk to different people, different pregnant women, we've all had different experiences of what's been told to us, so it's a really hard decision, and it's not one we've taken lightly, and like I say, we're still thinking about it and wondering whether we should or whether I should or I shouldn't.
People are so looking forward to going out, seeing their families, seeing their friends, and I think sometimes they might forget that there's a group of people who might be impacted differently.
Both Jo and Charlotte will avoid crowds for the last weeks of their pregnancy, but those needing to permanently shield face a long, lonely summer. Juliet Bremner, News at 10.
Robert and Tom have joined me in the studio. Tom, I'm going to start with you because I want to talk about the science. How risky is a moment like this?
Well, I think the risk isn't in the decision to open up. I mean, there's broad consensus. Now is the time to do it. But where the problem is the amount of uncertainties. We try to explain that report. The numbers could be extremely high. They might be really quite low, but given that uncertainty, opening up without any kind of checks on how rapidly we resume to normal behaviour is seen by a lot of public health experts as risky indeed. Now, it might be a gamble by the government. It might pay off. If it doesn't, there could be real risks there. One other thing that we haven't mentioned enough really is another thing we're looking at is the potential for new variants. We've got very high virus case numbers here in the UK now, and we've got a partially vaccinated population. If you want to design a world in which you create new variants, that's kind of it. So it really is so important. Those vaccines keep rolling out and people kind of restrict their behaviours as much as we possibly can, given we've now got our freedoms back.
But when you hear that, Robert, the question then really is why were they so keen to lift those restrictions today? Why didn't they wait till like the 16th of August, for example?
So I think the one thing that Tom implied is that the numbers that we're seeing are actually in line with the forecast that they've had for months. Now, most people would say you see forecasts of really rising infections and you know that's going to lead to increasing hospitalisations. You also know that's going to lead to an enormous amount of anxiety. So it is odd, again, as Tom implies, that they opened up without putting in place anything that will reassure, those who are clinically vulnerable and just the vast majority of people who have been used to wearing masks, social distancing for some considerable time and are anxious that if they stop doing that all in one big bang, it's all going to be terrible. And so I think the thing that is sort of politically odd is that the British people, I think, would have wanted actually for a little bit longer to have legal restrictions in place, such that if you were on the tube, actually it was legally enforceable to wear a mask rather than just being told by TfL that as a terms of carriage you have to wear a mask. There is a big distinction there. In one case you can call the police, in another you can't. What we are looking at now in terms of the rest of the world is known as the British experiment. Nowhere in the world have restrictions come off in the way that we've done when infections are going really rapidly higher. Now, this may be a gamble that will work for the government, but I think millions of British people are just saying, why are we taking a gamble? We didn't need to take a gamble. We could have put in place some measures that would have limited at least the rise in infections and would have made us feel all a little bit safer.
All right, well, both Tom and Robert, thanks so much for joining us in the studio. Thank you. Well, in Scotland, many but not all restrictions were lifted today. Wales and Northern Ireland will ease theirs later. The ITV News website has all the details of what you can and cannot do in all 4 home nations. The argument over vaccinating children has swung back and forth for well over a year. With the majority of adults double jabbed, scientists advising the government have come up with their recommendation. It isn't necessary to vaccinate all under 18s. But for those between 12 and 15 with health problems and under 18s who live with vulnerable adults, the benefits outweigh any possible risk.
Austin Clover has just finished his first year of high school, a remarkable achievement for a young man who was born with an immune system which didn't work. A stem cell transplant gave him the chance of a normal life, but the pandemic gave Austin more cause for worry than most kids his age. So he's looking forward to getting the vaccine and some peace of mind.
I don't think anyone's ever going to stop worrying until like a month or 2 after it properly goes away. But yeah, it'll definitely help me worry about it less.
Austin's been quite disgruntled. He hasn't had it when everybody else got it. Our adult children have already had it, so he's the only one that hasn't. After the transplant, we also found out that obviously his immune system needed to recover, and then we had to restart that all over again. So we know what it's like to have that period of no protection.
The steps we are taking today mean we will be offering even more vulnerable people the protection that a vaccine brings, and we will all be safer as a result.
The Vaccines Minister outlined a limited vaccine offering to teenagers within 3 months of their 18th birthday, children aged 12 to 15 with certain underlying health conditions, and those who live with adults who have weak immune systems. Other countries have moved much more quickly with this part of the population, vaccinating everyone aged between 12 and 18.
There are reports of heart inflammation, particularly in younger people, coming out from vaccination programs globally in the United States and Israel, for instance, in children. And so we want to examine that data before we advise universal vaccination for all children.
The risk that COVID presents to young people's health is relatively low, and yet positive tests and periods of self-isolation still cause immense disruption to their education.
There's no doubt that if we could start the new term next year and everyone's been vaccinated right the way through the secondary age groups, it would be easier for us. It definitely would. And I do worry about the further opening of all the restrictions today on what's supposedly known as Freedom Day is going to cause the pandemic to spread further.
The government keeps reminding us that the vaccine is our way out of this pandemic, but it is yet to be convinced that the benefits are big enough and the risks small enough for all teenagers to be given the jab. Geraint Vincent, News at 10.
The UK has formally blamed the Chinese government of orchestrating a massive cyber attack that affected 30,000 organisations around the world. The attack targeted Microsoft users in governments and businesses in March. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, called it systematic cyber sabotage. America, the European Union and NATO also accused the Chinese. As the water recedes, the number of people who died in the floods in Germany has carried on rising. So too has anger that not enough warning was given, even though weather forecasters have predicted unusually heavy rain. More than 190 people have been confirmed dead across Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, with perhaps hundreds more still missing.
To see how an entire landscape and hundreds of thousands of lives have been wrecked by these floods, you must follow the rivers that snake through western Germany and into the eastern parts of Belgium. Bridges wrecked, train lines undermined. Most devastating of all, houses simply smashed to pieces. The works of man, even those built with bricks and concrete, are truly no match for the power that nature can unleash.
This is the rubble from a terrace of 2 or 3 houses that were completely dismantled during the floods. And you wonder, how can water be so powerful? And then you look under the bridge there and see what the water was carrying with it. Trees, concrete, bricks. The force of that being swept down the river is what took these houses to pieces.
And of course, living in what they thought was the solid safety of their homes were ordinary people. People like Natalie Massa, whose entire ground floor filled with water, who won't now live in her home for many, many months.
It's a catastrophe, but in the other street, it's the war. I'm alive, voila.
So that's the most important thing.
That's the most important thing, yes. And my 2 daughters too. Voila.
While the authorities continue the search for the missing, people in town after town are clearing out before starting to rebuild. We came across an impromptu work gang in the German town of Erfstadt, dumping thousands of records, files, accounts from a flooded basement.
It really sucks.
It really sucks,
It
doesn't
really
it?
sucks. Indeed.
And who are these people helping? Do they all?
I have really no idea. Some of them I know, others I have never seen in my life. Just everybody that walks by just helps, which is really amazing.
A triumph of human kindness over unspeakable tragedy, but even as they clear up, many here are asking 2 questions. Why clear and precise warnings from meteorologists weren't taken seriously, nor the more general ones about what will happen if we ignore what's happening to the climate. James Mates, News at 10, Eastern Belgium.
And we have our own unusual weather to contend with here. The heat wave of the last couple of days has already led to 6 drownings as people cool off in lakes and rivers. It's likely to carry on in certain parts of the UK until Thursday, and that's prompted the Met Office to highlight the dangers of high temperatures. It's issued the first of its new extreme heat warnings.
On a hot day, there seems no better way to cool down.
But after a weekend of tragedy that reached the docks of Salford Quays in Manchester, experts are urging people not to risk swimming in open water. 19-year-old Napi Marenga died after being pulled from the water.
The young lad had just jumped in over there, and before you know it, his friends was just shouting out, help, help.
Across England, other beauty spots have turned into scenes of horror over the weekend. The body of a teenage boy was pulled from the River Eden near Stonyholme in Cumbria. Last night, a man's body was recovered in Sheffield, and another man in his 50s was pronounced dead after being pulled from the River Ouse in York. At 2:30 yesterday afternoon, emergency services were called to this lake in Witney in Oxfordshire. A teenage girl was pulled from the water, but she sadly died in hospital. With at least 6 people suspected of drowning this weekend, the Royal Life Saving Society are pleading with the public not to take any risks.
If this weekend isn't enough to bring the message home, I don't know what is. As you enter deeper water, the water gets colder, and unfortunately that can normally be the biggest factor in somebody losing their life.
That safety warning couldn't be more relevant. The Met Office has issued its first ever amber extreme heat warning for parts of England and Wales.
Whilst many of us enjoy hot and sunny weather, it does pose a health risk to those most vulnerable to heat health impacts. So older people, younger children, babies. It means that we should look out for others and make sure that they are safe during this time.
We can feel the power of the sun and know the dangers it poses. But with high temperatures here for the rest of the week, experts are warning about the invisible risks of cooling off in open water. Stacey Foster, News at 10.
We've had the interview and the podcasts. Now Prince Harry says he's writing a book about his life in which he says he will share the mistakes and lessons learned during his life. It's expected to cover growing up in the public eye as well as his marriage to Meghan and then move to California. He said the book will be an accurate and wholly truthful account of his life. It will be written, he says, not as the prince I was born, but as the man I have become. Profits from the book will go to charity. Finally, lots of people have had to put off celebrations because of COVID restrictions, things like birthdays, weddings, anniversaries, many of life's milestone moments. Well, tonight, it was party time at that national symbol of celebration and commemoration, the Royal Albert Hall. Not only was it open at full capacity for the first time since March last year, it was celebrating its 150th birthday, albeit 2 months late.
We have thrown wide open the doors of the Royal Albert Hall.
As composer David Arnold took to the stage tonight, the audience couldn't contain itself. At last, his symphony celebrating 150 years of the Royal Albert Hall, a history that now includes an unprecedented 18 months without a full audience, got its big outing. 5,500 were watching, masks encouraged but not enforced. With £900,000 spent on improvements to the ventilation system, the hall, which says it's lost £50 million in income, is hoping tonight is the start. For the performers, it's been a long time coming.
For so long we have either been playing to half full halls or to screens, and although that is an amazing interim, it's not the same as playing to a hall packed full of people and feeling that energy and electricity.
Here tonight, on our way back from the brink, after so long in joyless silent hibernation.
Amongst the guest speakers, former Spice Girl Mel C, reflections too on girl power from a century ago when the hall hosted meetings by women's suffrage groups, drawn here because of the venue's size, and to hear the likes of suffragette leader Emmeline Pankhurst address the capacity audience. Her great-granddaughter, invited to speak tonight, said the venue was ideal for them.
Amazing numbers. It had the kudos that it was the place where big events took place. You could use it as a fundraiser, you could use it as a galvaniser. It carried the kudos, the power of the building.
And when your great-grandmother spoke it was standing room only, wasn't it?
Absolutely packed. Hundreds of people still not being able to get in the doors because it was so full.
With so many events cancelled and having to be rescheduled, it is now full steam ahead for this venue. There are 4 other full capacity concerts here this week, and then it's the proms.
Tonight, this cultural venue celebrated its past while hoping this continues to be its future. Nina Nana, News at 10 at the Royal Albert Hall.
Oh, how beautiful to see live music again. OK, that's it from us for tonight. Don't forget to add the sunscreen tomorrow, but from all of us here, good night.